In this video, I'm gonna show you how you can integrate Azure Firewall with Load Balancer. And I'm gonna show you two scenarios, public load balancer and internal load balancer. However, you need to be aware that the public load balancer scenario is gonna be more special use case. Let's look at this diagram here to understand it better. So the traffic is gonna be coming from the internet, hitting the public IP address of my public load balancer. Then it's gonna route the traffic to the private IP address of my virtual machine. Then if you remember, we used to have an entry in the route table to instruct the traffic to go through the private IP address of my Azure Firewall. And when this happens, the response of this request, it's gonna go through the private IP address of my Azure Firewall, which ends up the traffic gets terminated. This is what we would call asymmetric traffic routing, where the traffic comes in from one path and goes out in a completely different path. And this is where Azure Firewall is gonna block it because it suspects it's ungenuine traffic. Because Azure Firewall sees a response to a request that hasn't come through the firewall. That's why Azure Firewall, it's gonna block it. Now let's see how can we turn it around. Now what we will do is to make the public IP address of my firewall to receive all traffic coming from the internet. Then I'm gonna forward the traffic to the public IP address of my load balancer, which is gonna forward it to the private IP address of my virtual machine. We still are going to have this route in the route table to instruct the traffic coming out from the virtual machine to go through the private IP address of my firewall as usual. However, I'm gonna add one new route entry in my route table to instruct the traffic to go to the public IP address of my Azure Firewall. In case of the next hop, it's gonna be the internet. Because now the public IP address of my Azure Firewall is able to see both the inbound request going to the public IP address of the load balancer, and also will be able to see the outbound response coming from the virtual machine. This is how we can avoid having asymmetric traffic routing in our scenario. Now let's go to the Azure portal and implement this scenario. I'm gonna go to virtual networks. I'm gonna create a new virtual network. I'm gonna create a new resource group. I'm gonna call it RG Load Balancer. And I'm gonna call my VNet name VNet Load Balancer. Alright, let's go to security and let's enable Azure Firewall. Standard tier. Let's create a new policy and a new public IP address. And let's go to IP addresses. And I'm gonna rename the default subnet name to be workload. And let's save my changes. And let's go ahead and create my virtual machine with the firewall. Now I will create two load balancers, public load balancer and a private load balancer, to show you both scenarios. So let's go to load balancer and create a new one. I'm gonna put it in RG load balancer. I'm gonna call it public load balancer. Australia East region standard tier, gonna make it public and regional. Let's go to the next page where I'm going to create a public IP address for my load balancer. I'm gonna call it load balancer IP. And let's create a new public IP address, call it load balancer PIP. And let's go ahead and save our changes. And let's go all the way down and create my public load balancer. And I'm gonna go ahead and create another internal load balancer. I'm gonna put it in RG load balancer. I'm gonna call it internal load balancer. Australia East, standard, internal, and regional. Now, when it comes to the front end IP configuration, I'm going to add load balancer IP. And then I'm going to select my VNet load balancer and the workload subnet. And I'm gonna assign a dynamic private IP address for my internal load balancer. And let's go all the way down and create my internal load balancer. And now I'm gonna go to virtual machines and create a new one that I'm gonna use for my test. So I'm gonna put it in RG load balancer. I'm gonna call it VM test. And I'm going to choose Windows Server 2019. I'm gonna put a username and password for my VM. And I don't need RDP port open. Let's go to networking. I'm gonna put it in VNet load balancer in workload subnet. And again, I don't need a public IP address for my VM. And let's go ahead and create my VM. Alright, let's go to load balancers, public load balancer, inbound NAT rules. And I'm going to add a new NAT rule. I'm gonna call it RDP. I'm going to choose my VM and the private IP address of my virtual machine. Then in the front-end IP address, I'm going to select the public IP address of my load balancer. The front-end port is going to be 3389. Service tag RDP. Backend port 3389 as well. Alright, and let's go ahead and save my changes. What this will allow me to do is from the public internet, I will be able to use the public IP address of my load balancer to access my virtual machine through its private IP address. And I will be able to do an RDP connection to my virtual machine through the load balancer. We've seen it before multiple times using Azure Firewall, and this is a different way to achieve RDP connection to a VM with a private IP address only. Alright. So let's get back, and my rule has been created. So let's open RDP connection to the public IP address of my load balancer. However, it's not able to get through because something is missing. So I'm gonna get back to my virtual machine and go to network settings. And I'm going to enable inbound port rule to RDP connection to enable port 3389. And let's go ahead and add this rule to my virtual machine. Now let's get back to my RDP. And let's try to connect to the public IP address of my load balancer one more time. Alright, as you can see here, I'm able to provide my username and password and do an RDP connection to my VM test. Alright, this is again through load balancer. Alright, now what we want to do now is to get that traffic to the load balancer coming from Azure Firewall. So if I will go back to my Azure Firewall and I will need to create a new, probably I will need to go to the policy, and I will need to create a DNAT rule. Let's add a rule collection. I'm gonna call it RCDNAT. Priority 100 in the default DNAT rule collection group. So I'm going to allow RDP from anywhere in the world using TCP protocol port 3389 and the firewall public IP address here. I need to browse to my firewall and get the public IP address of my firewall. Alright, let's get to VNet load balancer firewall public IP configuration. And let's copy the public IP address of my firewall and put it here in the destination IP address. Alright, translated type IP address. And then the translated address is going to be the public IP address of my load balancer over port 3389. Let's go ahead and add this rule. So let's get back to the diagram here. Now I have created a DNAT rule to translate any traffic coming from the internet hitting the public IP address of my firewall over port 3389. Translate that to the public IP address of my load balancer over port 3389 to allow me to get to an RDP connection to my VM through Azure Firewall, passing through the load balancer. However, I haven't created my route table routes yet. So let's go ahead and create it while we are waiting for the change to happen. So I'm gonna go to route tables and I'm gonna create a new route table. I'm gonna put it in RG load balancer, Australia East region, and I'm gonna call it RT load balancer. And let's go ahead and create my load balancer. My route table, sorry. Alright, let's go to my route table subnets and associate my route table to VNet load balancer workload subnet. Now let's go to routes and we are going to add the regular route that we used to add for all firewall scenarios. Not all scenarios, the scenarios where we want the traffic coming from a VM to pass through the private IP address for my firewall before it goes to anywhere else. So I'm gonna go back to my route table here and add an entry. I'm gonna call it route private IP for my firewall. And the destination type here it's gonna be IP address 5 zeros. And then the next hop it's gonna be a virtual appliance. Then the next hop address, I need to get back to my firewall and copy the private IP address of my firewall. And let's put it here in the next hop address. And let's go ahead and add our rule. Alright, now let's try to do an RDP connection to the public IP address of my firewall and see what we will get. So I'm gonna go back to my firewall and go to the public IP configuration, and then I'm gonna get the public IP address of my firewall and try to do an RDP connection. However, it's not gonna work because if you remember, now the traffic is gonna be coming, hitting the public IP address of the Azure firewall, going through the public IP address of the load balancer. Then it's gonna pass it through to the virtual machine. Now we have this route only in the route table where we are instructing the traffic coming out of the virtual machine to go through the private IP address of my Azure firewall, which didn't receive the initial request at the first place, which is not gonna work. That's why we need to add another route in our route table to direct the traffic to the public IP address of my Azure firewall and make the next hop to be the internet. Now let's get back to my route table here and add a new route. I'm gonna call it route public IP address of my firewall. The destination type is gonna be the IP address, and the destination IP address is gonna be the public IP address of my Azure firewall /32. Then the next hop it's gonna be just the internet. Now let's add this route to my route table. Alright, now let's get back and try to do an RDP connection one more time after we added these two routes in my route table. And as you can see here, I am now able to do an RDP connection to my VM, hitting the public IP address of my firewall first, passing through the public IP address of the load balancer, getting to the virtual machine that has only a private IP address. Alright, now let's get back to my VM, and if you remember, we allowed anywhere to be able to do an RDP connection to my VM, which is not a good idea. So if we want to restrict it further, so I'm going to choose an IP address only, and I'm going to put the public IP address of my Azure Firewall, and I'm going to select port 3389 to allow to have an RDP connection to my VM. It's going to be better than opening it to the whole world. Of course, we don't have a public IP address, but it's going to be better to restrict where the traffic should come from, which IP address, from which port. Let's go ahead and update our RDP rule. Alright, and let's do an RDP connection one more time. And again, as you can see here, we are still able to connect to my VM even after we tightened our inbound network rules for my VM. Alright, this was the public IP address scenario. And as I said before, it's a little bit more special and requires more attention compared to the internal load balancer, which is very straightforward. If you remember, I created both public and internal load balancer. So now I am going to go to the internal load balancer. And what I need to do now is to create an inbound NAT rule to my internal load balancer. I'm gonna call it RDP, internal virtual machine, VM test, the private IP address of my VM, then the private IP address of my internal load balancer, port 3389, and I'm going to choose RDP for my service tag. And the backend port is going to be 3389. And now let's go ahead and save my changes. Alright, now we have created this inbound NAT rule in our internal load balancer. So let's go to Overview tab and copy the private IP address of my internal load balancer. Now, I need to go to my firewall policies. Let's go to firewall policies. And in my DNAT rule, I am going to change it to forward the traffic or translate the traffic to the private IP address of my internal load balancer. And let's go ahead and save my changes. So now the traffic is going to be coming from the internet, hitting the public IP address of the firewall. Then we are going to translate it to the private IP address of my internal load balancer. However, for the internal load balancer case, we wouldn't need to add this route here to get the traffic to go through the public IP address of the Azure firewall, because you are talking private IPs now, so this entry wouldn't required anymore. So I can go ahead and delete this route from my route table. Alright, now let's try to do an RDP connection to my public IP address of the Azure firewall after we have done all of these changes to go through the internal load balancer instead of the public load balancer. As you can see here, the internal load balancer situation doesn't require an extra route in the route table or anything special. It should work as expected. Alright, that's all I have for you in this video. This is to show you how we can integrate both Azure Firewall with a public load balancer, and also I showed you how we can integrate it with an internal load balancer. Now let's go to my resource group and clean things up. So I'm going to delete my resource group. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.